On the night of November 14th, 1981, 12 men were systematically hunted and executed across the remote hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia, over a span of 19 hours. All adults, all between the ages of 21 and 47. The method? Rifle shots from distance, ambushes on dark mountain roads, executions in homes where the victims thought they were safe. The perpetrators, 5 members of the Henderson family, a father and his 4 sons, moving through the mountains like the ghosts of ancestors who had walked these same ridges for 7 generations. The West Virginia State Police would later call it the most calculated act of rural vengeance in Appalachian history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't drugs, wasn't a land dispute, wasn't even a family feud in the traditional sense. It was a Winchester Model 70 rifle, manufactured in 1952, stolen from a dying man's bedroom by people he'd considered neighbors, and a son who decided that some thefts demand payment in blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. McDowell County, West Virginia, in November of 1981, was a place that time had forgotten and poverty had claimed as its permanent residence. The county sprawled across 535 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain in the eastern United States. Deep hollows carved by ancient streams over millions of years, mountains that rose like fortress walls between communities, roads that turned to mud when it rained, and ice when winter came early, which it always did. Population had peaked at nearly 100,000 in 1950, when the coal mines were running 3 shifts, and money flowed through these hollows like the black water that ran from the mine portals. By 1981, fewer than 50,000 souls remained, and that number dropped every month as families packed up generations of memories and headed north to Ohio or west to Kentucky, anywhere that still had jobs, anywhere that still had hope. The geography of McDowell County was its defining feature and its curse. Mountains rose to 3,000 feet, their slopes covered in oak and hickory and pine that turned the hollows into tunnels of green in summer and gray in winter. The valleys between were narrow, sometimes barely wide enough for a creek and a road, and a few houses clinging to the hillsides. Communities with names like War, Iger, Bradshaw, and Kimball had grown up around mine portals, clusters of houses and company stores that served the men who went underground every day, and the families who waited for them to come back up. Welch, the county seat, sat in a narrow valley where the Elkhorn Creek met the Tug Fork River. Population maybe 4,000 in 1981, though it felt smaller. The main street had the look of a place that remembered better days and knew they weren't coming back. Storefronts stood empty, their windows dusty and dark. The movie theater had closed in 1978. The company, stores that had once supplied the mining camps with everything from food to furniture, were mostly gone, replaced by nothing at all. The few businesses that remained, a hardware store, a diner, a couple of bars, served a population that had less money to spend every year. November in the mountains meant temperatures dropping to the mid-20s at night, rising to maybe 45 degrees by afternoon, if the sun managed to break through the clouds that seemed to permanently settle over the hollows like a gray blanket. The air smelled like wood smoke from the coal stoves that heated most homes, damp leaves rotting on the forest floor, and that particular sharp scent of approaching winter that people who live in the mountains learn to recognize before they learn to read. It was a smell that said, "Prepare yourself. Hard times are coming." Of course, in McDowell County in 1981, hard times had already arrived and showed no signs of leaving. Mornings brought fog so thick you couldn't see 50 feet ahead on the road. Fog that rose from the creeks and settled into the hollows like something alive, something waiting for the sun to chase it away. The fog-muffled sounds made the mountains feel even more isolated than they already were, turned familiar roads into mysteries that had to be navigated by memory more than sight. The sound of the place was wind moving through bare branches, the creak of old houses settling on their foundations, the occasional rumble of a coal truck grinding up some impossible grade in low gear, gears protesting against the weight and the incline. And every so often, especially in November, the crack of a rifle shot echoing across the mountains, hunters taking deer or squirrel or turkey or whatever else moved in the woods. Gunfire was normal here, had been for 200 years since the first Scots-Irish settlers had arrived with their long rifles and their fierce independence and their absolute certainty that they answered to no law but their own. Nobody called the police when they heard shots in November. Nobody even looked up from what they were doing. But 1981 was a particularly brutal year in southern West Virginia, even by the standards of a region that had known more than its share of brutality. The coal industry that had sustained these mountains for a century was dying its slow, agonizing death. Mechanization had eliminated thousands of jobs. A continuous mining machine could do the work of a dozen men, and didn't need health insurance or pension contributions or union representation. Strip mining, which was cheaper and safer than deep mining, required a fraction of the workforce. The big companies were pulling out, leaving behind abandoned equipment rusting in the rain, polluted streams that ran orange with iron oxide, and families with no way to make a living in the only place they'd ever called home. In McDowell County, unemployment had hit 31% that fall, and those numbers didn't count the people who'd stopped looking for work entirely, who'd given up, who survived on food stamps and disability checks and the kind of informal economy that doesn't show up in government statistics. Young people who stayed did so because they couldn't afford to leave. Old people who stayed did so because they couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The mines had given their families purpose for generations, and now the mines were gone and nothing had arrived to take their place. In places like Bradshaw, War, and Eager, the small communities scattered through the hollows like beads on a broken string. People got by however they could. Some still worked the few mines that remained open, grateful for any paycheck, even if it meant breathing coal dust that would eventually kill them. Some drove an hour or more to jobs in Bluefield or Princeton, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, spending more on gasoline than they probably should have. Some hunted and trapped and gardened, living the way their great-grandparents had lived before the coal companies arrived with their promises of steady work and company housing, before the modern world had come to the mountains and then abandoned them. And some, a growing number that worried the old-timers who remembered when these communities had been different, cooked methamphetamine in trailers hidden back in the woods where the law would never find them, or grew marijuana in clearings that only the growers knew about, or ran stolen goods from one county to another, or did whatever else it took to survive when legitimate options had dried up like a creek in August. The old ways were dying, but they died hard in these mountains. Families still remembered feuds that had started before the Civil War, grievances passed down through generations like heirloom seeds or grandmother's recipes. Property lines were marked by stones that great-great-grandfathers had placed, boundaries that no survey could override because they had been established by handshakes between men long dead. And when someone wronged you, when someone stole from you, when someone disrespected your family, you didn't call the sheriff in Welch, 45 minutes away, on roads that might or might not be passable depending on the weather. By the time the sheriff got there, whatever needed handling would already be handled by family, by neighbors, by men who understood that some debts could only be paid in person. That was the code. Had been for generations, passed down from father to son, like the rifles they hunted with and the land they worked. A man takes care of his own problems. A man protects his family's honor. A man doesn't let thieves and liars prosper while good people suffer. It was a code that had kept order in these hollows when there was no other law, when the county seat might as well have been on the moon for all the help it could provide. It was also a code that could turn deadly when pushed too far, when grievance combined with pride and isolation to create something that the outside world would call murder, but that the mountains would call justice. The Tackett family had been causing trouble in McDowell County for 3 generations, long enough that their reputation preceded them into every interaction, every transaction, every conversation held in their absence. They'd arrived in the hollows sometime in the 1920s, come down from somewhere in Kentucky following rumors of coal jobs, and had never quite fit in with the established families who'd been working these mountains for a century before them. It wasn't that the Tacketts were outsiders exactly. Plenty of families had arrived during the coal boom and been absorbed into the community. It was something else, something in the way they operated, the shortcuts they took, the corners they cut. The Tacketts had always been willing to do things that other families wouldn't do, to cross lines that other families respected, to take advantage of situations that other families would have walked away from. By 1981, the family had spread across 2 hollows and into the town of Eager itself, maybe 30 or 40 people carrying the Tackett name or connected to it by marriage. A network of blood and obligation that protected its members from the consequences that might have caught up with others. Frank Tackett was the patriarch at 52 years old, though patriarch was too dignified a word for a man who'd spent his adult life taking whatever he could grab and damn the consequences. He'd worked in the mines briefly in his 20s, had quit after a roof collapse that hadn't injured him, but had scared him enough to decide that honest work wasn't worth the risk. Since then, he'd survived on a combination of disability payments, odd jobs, petty theft, and an increasingly profitable sideline in methamphetamine production that had grown from hobby to primary occupation over the past 5 years. Frank had a brother, Donnie, who was 48, and even less inclined toward honest work than Frank himself. Their cousin William Tackett, 44, had joined them in whatever enterprise they were currently running, providing muscle and transportation and a willingness to do violence that the brothers sometimes lacked. The three of them formed the core of what people in the Hollows simply called the Tackett Crew, a loose organization that also included various sons, nephews, and associates who drifted in and out depending on what was happening at any given time. Lester Burke was one of these associates, 40 years old, married to Frank's sister, a man who'd followed his wife into her family's orbit and discovered that he liked the work. He ran a small meth operation of his own, cooking in a trailer so far back in the hollow that you needed four-wheel drive and local knowledge just to find the road that led there. Tommy Wayne Jessup was another, 36, a childhood friend of Donnie's who'd never managed to break away from the Tackett influence. He provided transportation for stolen goods, had connections to fences in Bluefield and Princeton, who didn't ask questions about where merchandise came from. Carl Dean Maynard was younger, 33, but no less dangerous. He'd served 3 years in the state penitentiary at Moundsville for aggravated assault, had come out with new skills and fewer inhibitions. He was the one the Tacketts called when a situation required violence, when someone needed to be convinced that cooperation was in their best interest. The crew included others, a rotating cast of hangers-on and part-timers whose involvement varied depending on what was happening. Harold Blankenship, 49, who fenced stolen goods and didn't care where they came from. Roy Lee Hatfield, 42, who had a CDL and a box truck and was willing to transport just about anything. Junior Varney, 38, who ran a junkyard that served as a chop shop for stolen vehicles. Dennis Ray Coleman, 34, another meth cook who worked with Lester. Paul David Tackett, 31, Frank's nephew who was being groomed to eventually take over the family business. And George Steele, 26, the youngest of the core group, eager to prove himself, willing to do things that even the others hesitated to do. 12 men in total, if you counted the core group and the most active associates. 12 men who'd been stealing from their neighbors for years, who'd built a small empire of theft and drugs and intimidation that operated in the shadows of McDowell County's collapse. They weren't sophisticated criminals, weren't organized crime in any meaningful sense. They were just mountain men who decided that taking was easier than earning, that the old rules didn't apply to them, that they could operate with impunity because nobody had the power or the will to stop them. And for years, they'd been right. The sheriff's department was understaffed and underfunded, 3 deputies trying to cover 535 square miles of territory that included some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the eastern United States. The state police had bigger problems, focusing on the highways and the larger towns, leaving the Hollows to sort out their own affairs. The few families who'd tried to stand up to the Tacketts had learned quickly that resistance was futile and painful. Frank had made it clear, through words and actions and a couple of brutal examples, that anyone who caused him trouble would regret it. So people suffered in silence, accepted the losses as just another burden of living in a place where the law was distant and the lawless were close. Let it go. Didn't make trouble. Watch their tools disappear from their garages, their equipment vanish from their farms, their peace of mind erode year by year as the Tacketts grew bolder and more brazen. That was the situation in McDowell County in the fall of 1981, when the Tackett crew made the mistake that would cost all of them their lives. The Henderson family had lived in Laurel Hollow for 7 generations, since before West Virginia was a state, since the land was still part of Virginia and the mountains were still mostly wilderness. They'd been among the first settlers in this part of the county, had carved out homesteads when the only law was what you made yourself, had survived the Civil War and the timber boom and the coal boom and now the coal bust, had buried their dead in a family cemetery on the ridge above the hollow where headstones dated back to 1847. Elmer Henderson was 71 years old in November of 1981, the oldest living member of the family and its unquestioned patriarch. He'd worked the mines for 46 years, starting at 15 years old as a trapper boy, opening and closing the ventilation doors for the mule teams that hauled coal out of the darkness, working his way up to section foreman before the black lung got too bad for him to go underground anymore. He'd retired in 1975, had been slowly dying ever since, his lungs filling with the coal dust he'd breathed for nearly half a century. Elmer had married Dorothy Mae Collins in 1934 during the worst of the Depression, when having a job in the mines made you wealthy by the standards of people who had nothing at all. They'd raised 6 children in a 4-room house that Elmer had expanded piece by piece as the family grew, adding rooms and porches, and eventually a second story that leaned slightly to the east, but had stayed standing for 35 years. Dorothy had died in 1978, a stroke that took her in her sleep, and Elmer had lived alone since then in the house that echoed with memories of children and grandchildren and a lifetime of hard work and small victories. His children visited regularly. His grandchildren ran through the same rooms where their parents had grown up. But the nights were long and quiet, and Elmer spent most of them sitting in his chair by the wood stove, thinking about the past and waiting for the future that couldn't be far away. His oldest son was Vernon, 51, who'd followed his father into the mines and then out of them when the layoffs came. Vernon had worked at the Coalwood operation until it closed in 1978, had bounced around to other mines since then, taking whatever work he could find, watching the industry that had sustained his family for generations crumble around him. He'd married Martha Collins, a distant cousin of his mother's, and they'd raised 4 sons in a house a mile up the hollow from Elmer's place. Vernon's sons had grown into men who faced an uncertain future in a place that seemed to have no future at all. Thomas, the oldest at 32, had tried to escape the mountains, had spent 5 years in the Army, had come back with skills that had no application in McDowell County and anger that had no outlet. He worked construction when there was work, which wasn't often, and spent the rest of his time helping his father and grandfather with whatever needed doing. Samuel was 29, quieter than his older brother, had married and divorced and married again, had 2 children he was trying to raise right in a place that made raising children right almost impossible. Jacob was 26, had never married, lived in a trailer on his grandfather's property, and spent most of his time hunting and fishing and avoiding any kind of steady employment. And Daniel was 23, the youngest, just starting to figure out what kind of man he was going to be, caught between the world his father knew and a future that nobody could predict. The Hendersons weren't perfect people. Vernon had a temper that flared hot and fast, though it usually burned out quickly. Thomas had come back from the Army with demons that he fought with whiskey more often than anyone liked. Samuel's first marriage had ended badly, with accusations and recriminations that still echoed through family gatherings. Jacob was lazy, everyone knew it, content to live off his grandfather's land and his family's goodwill rather than making his own way. But they were solid people by the standards of McDowell County. They worked when there was work. They helped neighbors when help was needed. They paid their debts and kept their word, and raised their children to understand that a man's reputation was the only thing that couldn't be taken from him. They went to church at the Free Will Baptist congregation on Route 16, not every Sunday, but often enough. They'd never been in trouble with the law beyond a few speeding tickets and one drunk driving charge that Thomas had accumulated and paid off years ago. They didn't steal, didn't cheat, didn't cause trouble unless trouble came looking for them. But they had a reputation, the same kind of reputation that the Dawsons had in their hollow, that several old families had in their corners of the county. Everyone in McDowell County knew that you didn't mess with the Hendersons. That reputation went back generations, to feuds that had been settled with rifle fire, to slights that had been repaid with interest, to the understanding that this particular family took care of its own and had long memories for anyone who crossed them. The last time someone had seriously wronged the Henderson family had been in 1963, when a man from Welch had cheated Elmer in a timber sale, had paid him half of what the timber was worth, and then disappeared before Elmer realized he'd been swindled. Vernon and his brothers had tracked the man down, had paid him a visit that resulted in broken bones and a full refund, and a permanent understanding that the Henderson family was not to be trifled with. No charges were ever filed. No official consequences followed. That was how things worked in these mountains, and everyone understood the rules. Elmer Henderson had a rifle that meant more to him than any other possession he'd ever owned. A Winchester Model 70, manufactured in 1952, chambered in 30 Daziac Springfield. He'd bought it new that year from the hardware store in Welch, paid $89.50, which was nearly 2 weeks' wages at the time. He'd been 42 years old, established in the mines, finally making enough money to afford something nice for himself, something that wasn't a necessity but a luxury, a reward for 27 years of hard work underground. That rifle had taken more deer than Elmer could count over 29 years of hunting. He'd carried it through these mountains every November since 1952, knew every scratch on the stock, every worn spot on the bluing, the particular way the action felt when you worked it, smooth as butter after tens of thousands of cycles. He'd taught Vernon to shoot with it, and then all 4 of his grandsons. The stock was worn smooth where his hands had gripped it, polished by decades of use into something that felt like an extension of his own body. The rifle had seen him through some of the best times of his life, hunting trips with his sons when they were young, camping in the mountains, cooking venison over an open fire, teaching them the skills that their grandfathers had taught him. The rifle had fed his family during lean years when money was tight and store-bought meat was a luxury. It had hung over his fireplace through good times and bad, a constant reminder of who he was and what he'd built. When the cancer diagnosis came in September of 1981, lung cancer metastasized to the bones. 6 months if he was lucky, Elmer had one request for his sons. That rifle goes to Vernon when I'm gone. He's the oldest. He'll take care of it. Keep it in the family. I want it passed down, generation to generation, long as there's Hendersons in these mountains. Everyone understood. Everyone agreed. The Winchester would pass to Vernon, and someday to Vernon's oldest son Thomas, and someday to Thomas's children. 7 generations the Hendersons had lived in these mountains. The rifle would help carry that legacy forward, a physical connection between the generations, something that could be touched and held and used, proof that the family had been here and would continue to be here. What nobody expected was that someone would steal it before Elmer had the chance to die. The theft occurred on the night of October 23, 1981, a Friday, while Elmer was in the hospital in Welch for another round of treatments that everyone knew wouldn't help, but that the doctors kept recommending and Medicare would pay for. The house sat empty, doors unlocked because nobody in Laurel Hollow locked their doors. It was unthinkable, really. Everyone knew everyone. You could leave your house wide open for a week and nothing would be touched, because everyone knew whose house it was and what would happen if anything went missing. Except, the Tacketts didn't operate by those rules. The Tacketts operated by their own rules, which said that anything not actively guarded was fair game, that weakness invited exploitation, that a dying man's house was just an opportunity waiting to be seized. Samuel discovered the theft on Saturday morning when he drove over to check on the house, make sure the pipes hadn't frozen overnight, bring in the mail that nobody had collected for 3 days. He found the back door, standing open, swinging slightly in the cold October wind. Inside, the house had been tossed. Not ransacked exactly, but searched. Drawers opened, cabinets rifled, as if someone had been looking for something specific. The gun cabinet in the bedroom was empty. Elmer's Winchester was gone. So was his shotgun, a Remington 870 that wasn't worth much monetarily, but had sentimental value going back decades. So was $340 in cash that Elmer kept in a coffee can under the sink, money he'd been saving slowly for 3 years, setting aside a little bit every month from his Social Security check. Funeral money because he didn't want to burden his sons with the expense of burying him. Samuel called his father. Vernon drove over immediately, stood in the violated house, looked at the empty gun cabinet, felt something building in his chest that he recognized from long ago, from the last time someone had made the mistake of crossing the Henderson family. Vernon called the sheriff's department in Welch. A deputy came out on Monday afternoon, took a report, walked through the house, said he'd look into it, said they'd been having a lot of break-ins lately, said it was probably someone from out of the area, said he'd check with the pawn shops in Bluefield to see if anyone had tried to sell the weapons. Everyone knew nothing would come of it. Property crimes in McDowell County almost never got solved. The sheriff's department had 3 deputies to cover 535 square miles of territory that included terrain where you could hide an army if you knew what you were doing. They had bigger problems than a stolen rifle, problems that had names and badges and urgency. The deputy was apologetic, understanding, clearly aware that he was telling a family that their hopes for justice were essentially zero. But the Hendersons had their own ways of investigating. Within 3 days, through conversations and observations and the particular intelligence network that exists in small communities where everyone knows everyone's business, where every transaction is noted and every movement is observed, they had their suspects. The Tackett crew, Frank and Donnie and William, the associates who ran with them, the whole rotten organization that had been plaguing the county for years. The evidence wasn't the kind that would hold up in court, but it was convincing enough for the Hendersons. George Steele, the youngest of the Tackett crew, had been seen drinking at a bar in Eager the weekend after the theft, buying rounds for everyone, bragging that he'd come into some money. When someone asked where the money came from, George had smiled that smile of his, the one that said he knew something you didn't, and said something about a big score on the other side of the mountain. More importantly, someone had seen the Winchester itself. A man named Bobby Ray Coleman, no relation to Dennis Ray Coleman, who ran with the Tacketts, had been at Frank Tackett's place 3 days after the theft, buying some weed for personal use, when he'd noticed a rifle he didn't recognize leaning against the wall in Frank's living room. A Winchester Model 70, old but well-maintained, exactly the kind of rifle that Elmer Henderson had treasured for 29 years. Bobby Ray had mentioned this to his cousin, who'd mentioned it to someone at church. who'd mentioned it to Vernon Henderson's wife Martha after Sunday services, the chain of information moving through the community the way it always moved, invisible but relentless. By the end of the first week of November, the Hendersons knew who had stolen Elmer's rifle. The question was what to do about it. Elmer Henderson came home from the hospital on October 30th, 1981. The cancer was winning, everyone could see that. He'd lost 30 pounds since the diagnosis, his clothes hanging on him like they belonged to someone else. His skin had taken on a yellowish tint that spoke of liver involvement. His breathing came in rattles that made Vernon's wife weep when she heard them. 6 months, the doctor had said, in September. Now it looked more like 6 weeks, maybe less. They tried to keep the theft from him, tried to pretend everything was normal, that the gun cabinet was empty because Vernon had taken the weapons home for cleaning, something they'd always done as winter approached. But Elmer wasn't fooled. He'd lived 71 years in these mountains, had raised 6 children, had survived decades of hard work and harder times. He could read his family's faces like he read the weather, and he knew something was wrong from the moment he walked through his own front door. On the morning of November 2nd, Elmer called Vernon into his bedroom. The old man was propped up on pillows, oxygen tubes in his nose, looking like something that was already more dead than alive. But his eyes were clear, and his voice, though weak, carried the authority that had commanded respect for half a century. "Tell me," Elmer said. "Tell me what happened to my rifle." Vernon sat down heavily in the chair beside his father's bed, the chair where Dorothy had sat reading to Elmer during his previous hospitalizations, the chair that still seemed to hold her presence somehow. He didn't want to tell his father, didn't want to add this burden to everything else the old man was carrying, but he'd never lied to his father in 51 years, and he wasn't going to start now. Vernon told him the break-in, the theft, the suspects, the useless deputy who'd come and gone and would accomplish nothing. The understanding that official justice was not going to happen, not in McDowell County, not for something like this. Elmer listened without interrupting, his yellowed eyes fixed on his son's face, his breathing shallow but steady. When Vernon finished, the old man was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling, processing information that seemed to drain what little energy he had left. The house was silent except for the hiss of the oxygen and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees outside. November wind, cold and insistent, carrying the smell of winter that was coming. That rifle, Elmer said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, was the first real thing I ever owned. First thing I bought with money I earned myself, not hand-me-downs or borrowed or bought on credit from the company store. I carried it for 29 years, taught you to shoot with it and your boys. It was supposed to go to you when I passed, then to Thomas when you pass. Keep it in the family, generation after generation. I know, Daddy, I know. Frank Tackett took it. Elmer's voice hardened, found strength and anger that the cancer hadn't touched yet. That worthless piece of trash walked into my home while I was in the hospital dying. Walked in like he had a right to be there and took my rifle. Took the money I saved for my own funeral, money I set aside month after month so I wouldn't be a burden to my family. Took the dignity of a man who never did nothing to him, never said a word against him, never caused him any trouble. We'll get it back, Vernon said. I promise you, Daddy. Whatever it takes, we'll get it back. Elmer shook his head slowly, the movement costing him visible effort. Getting it back ain't enough. Not nearly enough. A man breaks into a dying man's home, steals his most precious possession. That man needs to learn that some things you don't do, some lines you don't cross, that there's consequences for disrespecting the Henderson family. If you let this go, if you just take it and move on, what does that say about us? That we're weak, that anyone can do anything they want to us and we'll just roll over and accept it? Daddy, the sheriff. The sheriff ain't gonna do nothing. Vernon knew his father was right even before the words were out. The sheriff never has, never will. Not for people like us, not in places like this. This is family business, Vernon, mountain business, and it needs to be handled the mountain way. Vernon looked at his father, saw something in those yellowed eyes that he'd seen before, years ago, when that man from Welch had cheated Elmer in the timber deal, a cold fire that burned beneath the surface, patient and absolute. That man had ended up in the hospital with a broken jaw and 3 cracked ribs, and nobody in McDowell County had ever cheated Elmer Henderson again. What do you want me to do? Vernon asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it from the moment Samuel called him about the break-in. Elmer's hand, thin and spotted with age, the hand that had worked underground for 46 years, reached out and gripped Vernon's wrist with surprising strength. You find Frank Tackett and his people, every one of them that was involved. And you make them understand that stealing from the Hendersons has consequences, that my rifle, my legacy, the only thing of real value I have to leave my family, ain't something to be pawned for drug money or traded for whiskey or forgotten in some closet. He paused, coughed, the sound wet and ominous, spat into a tissue that came away spotted with blood. Can you do that for me, son? Can you give me that peace before I go? Can you let me die knowing that my family stood up for me, that the Henderson name still means something in these mountains? Vernon Dawson looked at his father, the man who'd raised him, who taught him everything he knew about being a man in these mountains, about working hard and keeping your word and standing up for your family no matter the cost. The man who was dying, who'd been robbed in his own home, who deserved better than to leave this world knowing that thieves had taken his most prized possession and gotten away with it. Yes, sir, Vernon said, I can do that. He left his father's bedroom with the weight of that promise settling over him like a physical thing, like the mountain itself had descended onto his shoulders. He knew what it meant, knew what he was committing to, knew that making them understand in the mountain way meant something very different than filing a police report or hiring a lawyer. But in McDowell County in 1981, there were some debts that could only be paid in blood. Frank Tackett had just incurred one that would take his life and the lives of 11 others to settle. The planning began the same night, November the 2nd, 1981, in Vernon's kitchen. The house was small, 4 rooms that Vernon had expanded and improved over 25 years of marriage. But the kitchen was large enough for a family gathering. Martha had taken herself to bed early, understanding without being told that something was happening that she didn't want to know about. Around the table sat Vernon and his 4 sons, Thomas, Samuel, Jacob, and Daniel, 5 men ranging in age from 23 to 51. 3 generations of Hendersons who were about to plan something that would change all their lives forever. Vernon laid out what they knew: the Tackett crew, Frank and Donnie and William, the associates, Lester Burke, Tommy Wayne Jessup, Carl Dean Maynard, and the others, whose names they had gathered through the Community Intelligence Network. The information from Bobby Ray Coleman about seeing the Winchester at Frank's place. The core group is maybe 6 men, Vernon said. Frank, Donnie, William, Lester, Tommy Wayne, and Carl Dean. They're the ones who run things, the ones who make decisions. But when they get together, when they're partying or counting money or whatever they do, could be 10 or 12, maybe more. Thomas, the oldest grandson at 32, spoke first. He'd been quiet since arriving, his face hard to read, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. We're talking about more than just getting the rifle back, aren't we? Vernon looked at his son. Thomas had spent 5 years in the Army, had learned things there that he didn't talk about, had come back with skills that had no application in civilian life, and a willingness to use violence that sometimes worried his father. But right now, those skills and that willingness might be exactly what the family needed. Your grandpa wants a message sent, a clear message that you don't steal from the Hendersons, that we're not people you can wrong and walk away from. That message needs to be clear enough that nobody will ever try something like this again. That could mean a lot of things, Thomas said carefully. Beating them up, burning down their buildings. Or it could mean... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Everyone at the table understood exactly what he was suggesting. Samuel, 2 years younger than Thomas, had been staring at the table, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked up, his face troubled. Grandpa's dying. He's got weeks, maybe days. The one thing he asked for, the only thing, is justice for what was done to him, for what they took from him. Are we going to give it to him or not? It ain't that simple, Vernon said. The Tacketts got guns too, got friends, got family who might feel obligated to retaliate. This goes wrong, gets out of control. It could turn into a war, a real war, the kind these mountains haven't seen in generations. Jacob, who was 26 and had spent more time in the woods than any of them, more time hunting and tracking and learning the terrain, spoke up for the first time. It don't have to be a war, not if we do it right. Not if we hit them all at once before they know what's happening, before they have time to react or organize or call for help. One night, one operation, and it's over. The room went quiet. What Jacob was suggesting wasn't just revenge, it was elimination. Removing the Tackett crew from existence in a single coordinated strike, like cutting out a cancer before it could spread. Daniel, the youngest at 23, hadn't said a word. He sat in the corner of the kitchen, watching his father and brothers with those quiet eyes that gave nothing away. Daniel was still figuring out who he was, still trying to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. This conversation was going to help him decide. "Daniel?" Vernon asked. "You got something to say?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady, older than his years. Grandpa's right. What they did wasn't just theft, it was disrespect. They knew he was dying, knew the house was empty, knew nobody would do anything about it because nobody ever does anything about what they do. They thought we'd be like everyone else, just take it and move on. That's what people do nowadays, Samuel said quietly. Let things go. Don't make trouble. Accept that the world isn't fair and there's nothing you can do about it. Daniel shook his head. Maybe other people, not Henderson's. We let this slide. We're telling everyone in the county that we're weak, that anyone can do anything to us and we won't fight back, that the Henderson name don't mean what it used to mean. Is that what we want? Is that the legacy we're leaving for our children? The question hung in the air. 5 men around a kitchen table, each one calculating costs and consequences, each one weighing loyalty against survival, tradition against sanity, the love they bore for a dying patriarch against the lives they'd be destroying. Vernon made the decision. It was his to make. He was the oldest, the one who'd received the promise from his father, the one who would bear the weight of whatever happened next. We hit them Saturday night, he said. November 14th. That's when they'll all be together at Frank's place. I've heard they have a regular gathering, drinking and carrying on, counting whatever money they've made that week. We take them out, every one of them that was involved, and we send a message that'll echo through these mountains for the next 100 years. The Hendersons are not to be crossed. What about ones who weren't involved? Thomas asked, his military training showing in the way he thought through scenarios. What about wives, children? What about people who just happened to be there? We don't hurt women or children. Vernon's voice was hard as mountain stone. That's the line. That's where we draw it and don't cross over. But any man who was part of this crew, who helped the Tacketts or ran with them or knew what they were doing and kept quiet about it, they all answer for it. They made their choice when they threw in with Frank Tackett. Now they live with the consequences, or die with them. The planning took the next 12 days. They worked methodically, the way Vernon had learned to work in the mines, the way Thomas had learned to work in the army. Nothing rushed, nothing sloppy. Every detail considered, every contingency addressed, every potential problem solved before it could become an actual problem. Jacob did the reconnaissance. He was the woodsman of the family, the one who could move through the forest without making a sound, who knew these mountains better than anyone alive. He spent hours in the woods around the Tackett property, mapping Frank's place in detail, counting vehicles at different times of day, noting who came and went, building a picture of the crew's patterns and routines. The Tackett compound sat at the head of a hollow about 6 miles from the Henderson home place, separated by a ridge that rose 1,500 feet above the valley floor. Frank had inherited 30 acres from his father, had added a trailer for Lester and another for storage, had built a crude garage where they worked on vehicles, and occasionally cooked meth when Lester's trailer got too hot from law enforcement attention. Jacob identified 12 men who were regular visitors, 12 men who were likely involved in the operation at some level, 12 men who would need to be dealt with if the Henderson family was going to send the message they intended to send. Frank Tackett, Donnie Tackett, William Tackett, the core 3, the ones who'd orchestrated the theft. Then Lester Burke, Tommy Wayne Jessup, Carl Dean Maynard, the inner circle who ran the day-to-day operations. Harold Blankenship, the fence. Roy Lee Hatfield, the driver. Junior Varney, the junkyard owner who probably stored the stolen goods. Dennis Ray Coleman, the other meth cook. Paul David Tackett, Frank's nephew being groomed for leadership. And George Steele, the youngest. The one who'd been bragging about the big score. 12 men, 12 targets, 5 Hendersons to take them down. Thomas handled weapons and tactics. The family had an arsenal accumulated over generations, rifles and shotguns for hunting, and the occasional handgun that had found its way into the collection over the years. Vernon had a Remington Model 700 in .308 Winchester, a precision rifle that could reach out to 800 yards in the right hands. Thomas had his M1 Garand from a gun show, the same rifle his grandfather had carried in the Pacific during World War II, semi-automatic, powerful, reliable. Samuel had a Marlin lever action in .30-30, not as accurate at long range, but devastating at close quarters. Jacob had his scoped N36, a Savage Model 110 that he'd used to take deer at distances that seemed impossible. Daniel would carry a shotgun, a Mossberg 500 pump that could clear a room if needed. They also gathered handguns, Vernon's .357 Magnum revolver that he'd owned since the 1960s, a couple of .38 specials that had been in the family for decades, a 1911 .45 automatic that had belonged to Vernon's uncle, a souvenir from the Korean War. backup weapons in case the primary rifles failed or in case situations developed that required close work. Samuel handled logistics, vehicles, routes, timing. He'd driven these roads his entire life, knew every shortcut and back road and logging trail in the county. He mapped out approach routes to the Tackett property, identified positions where shooters could be placed with clear fields of fire, planned withdrawal routes that would get them home without being seen. Daniel, young Daniel, who was supposed to be figuring out what kind of man he wanted to be, handled intelligence. He talked to people, asked casual questions that didn't seem casual, picked up information that others missed. He confirmed that the Saturday night gatherings at Frank's place usually started around 7 p.m. and ran until 2 or 3 in the morning, that there were usually 10 to 15 men present, depending on the week, that the women and children, such as there were, stayed in the trailers behind the main house, away from the drinking and drugging and whatever else the men got up to. By November 12th, they had a complete plan. By November 13th, they had their equipment staged at Vernon's place, weapons cleaned and loaded, vehicles gassed and ready. By the morning of November 14th, they were as prepared as they were going to be. That morning, Vernon drove down the hollow to see his father one last time. Elmer was worse. The cancer was consuming him from the inside out, eating him alive day by day. He barely had the strength to open his eyes when Vernon came into the bedroom, the room that still smelled faintly of Dorothy's perfume, even 3 years after her death. "We're doing it tonight," Vernon said quietly, sitting in the chair beside the bed. All 12 of them. Everyone who was part of it or benefited from it. Elmer's hand found Vernon's, gripped it with a strength that seemed impossible given how wasted his body had become. "Good," the old man whispered. "That's good. You're a good son, Vernon. Your mother would be proud. I'm proud." They sat in silence for a while, father and son, the dying and the about to be damned. Vernon had a question he needed to ask, a question that had been eating at him for 12 days, keeping him awake at night, haunting his prayers. "Daddy, is this right? What we're about to do?" Elmer's eyes opened, met Vernon's. In those yellowed, pain-filled eyes, Vernon saw something he recognized. Certainty. Conviction. The absolute knowledge of a man who'd lived 71 years and seen enough to know that some things had to be done, regardless of the cost. Right? Elmer's voice was barely audible, a whisper from somewhere far away. "Boy, I've lived in these mountains for 71 years. I've seen men steal and cheat and lie and get away with it. I've seen the law look the other way while good people suffered, and I've seen what happens when good men finally stand up and say enough. Say that this far and no farther." He coughed, the sound wet and terrible, bringing up blood that he spat into a tissue. "The Tacketts are a cancer," Elmer continued when he could speak again. "Like the cancer eating my lungs. They've been spreading through this county for years, taking what they want, hurting who they want, knowing nobody will stop them because nobody ever does. Somebody needs to cut them out clean and complete so they don't grow back. Might as well be us, might as well be the family they wronged, and the others, the ones on the edges, the ones who might not have been directly involved. Anyone who runs with Frank Tackett knows what he is. They see what he does. They benefit from his crimes. They made their choice when they threw in with him. Now they live with the consequences of that choice, or die with them." Vernon nodded slowly. He'd needed to hear it from his father, needed that blessing, that permission, that absolution in advance for what he was about to do. Without it, he might have backed out, might have found some excuse to let the matter drop, to pursue some legal remedy that would accomplish nothing but would let him tell himself he'd tried. But with his father's blessing, with those yellowed eyes fixed on him and that wasted hand gripping his, Vernon felt the last of his hesitation fall away. "One more thing," Elmer said. "That rifle, the Winchester. If you find it, you bring it back. I want to hold it one more time before I go. Want to feel it in my hands, remember all the years I carried it, all the deer I took with it, all the times I took you boys out hunting. That's not too much to ask, is it? One last time?" Vernon squeezed, his father's hand feeling the bones beneath the paper-thin skin, feeling how little of his father was left. "I'll bring it back, Daddy, I promise. Whatever else happens tonight, I'll bring back your rifle." He left Elmer's house at 11:30 a.m. on November 14th, 1981. 13 hours later, 12 men would be dead, and Vernon Henderson would have kept both of his promises. At 6:47 p.m. on Saturday, November 14th, 1981, the temperature had dropped to 27 degrees. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear in the east as the last light faded in the west. The moon a thin crescent that would provide minimal illumination, which was exactly what the Henderson family needed. A cold wind came from the northwest, carrying the smell of snow that might come in a few days, the first snow of the season. Vernon Henderson sat in the cab of his pickup truck, an old Ford F-250 that he'd bought used in 1973 and had kept running through sheer stubbornness and mechanical skill. The truck was parked on a logging road on the ridge above the Tackett property, hidden from view by a stand of hemlocks that had somehow escaped the loggers who'd cleared most of the ridge 40 years ago. Through a gap in the trees, he could see the Tackett compound below, Frank's main house, a rambling structure that had been added to over the years without any regard for aesthetics or building codes. The two trailers behind it, one where Lester Burke lived with Frank's sister, one used for storage and occasional meth production, the garage where they worked on vehicles, and scattered outbuildings whose purposes Vernon could only guess at. Lights were on in the main house. Vehicles filled the dirt yard, 8 or 9 of them, which matched Jacob's intelligence about Saturday night gatherings. Music drifted up from below, country music that Vernon might have enjoyed under different circumstances, someone singing about loss and redemption. In the passenger seat, Thomas was checking his M1 Garand one final time, running through the routine he'd learned in the Army, making sure everything was exactly right. 8 rounds in the internal magazine, more in cloth bandoliers across his chest. His face was calm, focused, the face of a man who'd done violence before and knew what it cost. In a second truck parked 200 yards back, Samuel and Jacob waited. Samuel had the Marlin, lever-action, 10 rounds in the tube magazine. Jacob had his scoped rifle, the one that could reach out and touch someone at 400 yards in conditions like these, maybe farther. Daniel was already in position, had been for 2 hours. He'd moved through the woods on foot, silent as a ghost the way Jacob had taught him, finding a spot on the slope below the compound where he could watch the back of the property and make sure nobody escaped into the woods. He had the shotgun and a walkie-talkie, and the nervous energy of a young man about to participate in something that would define the rest of his life. Vernon keyed the walkie-talkie. "Daniel, report." The response came immediately, Daniel's voice barely above a whisper, but clear in the cold night air. 8 vehicles in the yard. I count 11 men visible through the windows, maybe more in other rooms. No movement in the trailers. Looks like the women are in there, can see a TV going. Any children? I can see 2, maybe 3. Hard to tell from here. They're in the trailer with the women, away from the main house. Good. Keep eyes on that trailer. Anyone moves toward the main house, you let us know immediately. We don't want women or children getting caught in this. Copy. Vernon set down the radio, looked at Thomas. This is it. Last chance to turn around. Thomas met his father's eyes. Vernon saw something there he recognized, something he'd seen in his own father's eyes, in his grandfather's eyes in old photographs, in the eyes of Henderson men going back generations. The cold certainty of a man who'd made his decision and would live with the consequences. Grandpa asked for this. You promised him. We all did, in our way. Henderson family doesn't break promises. Vernon nodded slowly, checked his own rifle, the Remington 700, made sure there was a round in the chamber. All right, on my signal, we move in. Thomas, you take the east side. I'll take the west. Samuel and Jacob will cover the front and back. Nobody gets out. Nobody. And if they surrender? Thomas asked. If they put down their guns and give up? Vernon was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father lying in that bed, dying by inches, robbed of the one possession he treasured most. Thought about the Tacketts walking into that house like they owned it, taking what they wanted, laughing about it afterward. They had their chance to be decent people, Vernon said. They chose different. We're not here to arrest them, Thomas. We're here to eliminate them. At 7:23 p.m., the 5 Henderson men began their approach. They moved down from the ridge in 2 groups, using the terrain for cover, staying in the shadows where the failing light couldn't reach. Jacob led one group, Samuel behind him, both of them moving with the confidence of men who knew these mountains intimately. Vernon and Thomas came from a different angle, flanking the compound, making sure they'd have clear fields of fire when the shooting started. The woods were quiet except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant sound of music from the house below. Country music, fiddles and steel guitars, someone singing about how things used to be better. At 7:41 p.m., everyone was in position. Vernon and Thomas had the west side of the property, crouched behind a woodpile that gave them a clear view of the front porch and the main entrance. From here, Vernon could see figures moving behind the windows, silhouettes against lamplight, men drinking and laughing without any idea what was coming. Samuel and Jacob had the east side, positioned behind an old shed that had collapsed decades ago, the rotting timbers providing excellent cover. They could see the back door, the path to the trailers, the woods that someone might try to escape into. Daniel was in the hollow below, covering the only other escape route, the road that led down the mountain to the main highway. Vernon keyed the radio one final time. Sound off. Thomas in position. Samuel in position. Jacob in position. Daniel in position. No movement from the trailer. Women and kids are still inside. On my shot. Vernon's voice was steady, betraying none of the hurricane of emotions beneath the surface. We take down anyone who comes outside, then we move in, clear the house. Nobody gets out. This ends tonight. He raised the Remington, settled the crosshairs on the front door of the house. His hands were steady. His breathing was slow and controlled. 40 years of hunting had taught him how to wait, how to be patient, how to take the shot when it presented itself. At 7:47 p.m., the front door opened. A man stepped out onto the porch, lit a cigarette, stood there smoking and looking up at the stars. Vernon recognized him through the scope. Donnie Tackett, Frank's brother, one of the core members of the crew, definitely involved in the theft, definitely deserving of what was coming. Vernon centered the crosshairs on Donnie's chest, said a prayer that was half apology to God and half request for forgiveness that he knew might never come. Then he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot shattered the peaceful night, echoing off the mountains, rolling through the hollows like thunder. Donnie Tackett staggered backward, the cigarette falling from his fingers, his body crumpling against the porch railing. For a moment, everything was frozen. The music kept playing inside. Then someone shouted, a wordless cry of alarm, and the night exploded into violence. Thomas's M1 Garand barked twice, taking down a man who appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shot. The man fell backward into the house, knocking over a lamp, the sound of breaking glass mixing with screams of terror and confusion. Men poured out the back door, running for the woods, and Samuel's Marlin began its deadly work. The lever action cracked once, twice, 3 times, each shot finding a target. Jacob's scoped rifle picked off the ones who made it farther, who thought they'd escaped the kill zone, reaching out across distances that should have been impossible in the failing light. The killing lasted less than 5 minutes. Some of the Tacketts had guns, managed to return fire, but they were shooting blind, panicked, didn't know where the attackers were positioned, didn't have time to organize any kind of defense. The Hendersons had planned too well, had positioned themselves too carefully, had achieved complete surprise against men who'd thought they were untouchable. Frank Tackett died in his own living room, hit 3 times as he tried to reach the rifle mounted above his fireplace, probably stolen from someone else. His brother Donnie was already dead on the porch. William Tackett made it 30 yards into the woods before Jacob's rifle found him, the shot dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. Lester Burke tried to hide in the bathroom, was shot through the door by Thomas, who'd entered the house through the front while the survivors were focused on escaping out the back. Tommy Wayne Jessup made it to his truck, actually got the door open, before Samuel put 2 rounds through the driver's window. Carl Dean Maynard, the violent one, tried to fight back, had a pistol in his hand, got off 1 wild shot that hit nothing before Vernon ended him. Harold Blankenship, Roy Lee Hatfield, Junior Varney, Dennis Ray Coleman, Paul David Tackett, George Steele, the young one who'd bragged about the big score. One by one, the 12 men who'd gathered at Frank Tackett's house on that Saturday night met their ends. Some died quickly, cleanly, without ever knowing what was happening. Others took longer, wounded and crawling and begging for mercy that wouldn't come. At 7:52 p.m., the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. No more gunfire, no more screaming, just the wind in the bare trees and the sound of the radio still playing inside the house. Some commercial now, someone selling trucks at a dealership in Bluefield. Vernon's voice came over the walkie-talkie, older and more tired than it had been 5 minutes ago. "Daniel, report on the trailer." Daniel's voice came back, shaky for the first time all night. "Women are inside, doors locked. I can hear them crying, but nobody's come out. Nobody's tried to run." "Good. You stay there. Make sure they stay put. We don't want them seeing anything they don't need to see. Copy." Vernon and Thomas moved through the property, checking bodies, making sure there were no survivors. There were none. The Hendersons had been thorough, had put extra rounds into anyone who showed signs of life, had made sure that the message they were sending would be absolutely clear. 12 bodies lay scattered across Frank Tackett's property, in the yard and on the porch and inside the house, blood soaking into the dirt and the floorboards, spreading in pools that steamed slightly in the cold November air. Thomas found the Winchester Model 70 in Frank's bedroom closet, propped against the wall with a dozen other rifles that had probably been stolen from other people's homes. He picked it up, felt the familiar weight of it, the smooth action that his grandfather had maintained for 29 years. "Got it," Thomas said into the radio. "The Winchester. It's here." Vernon came into the bedroom, looked at the rifle in his son's hands. The rifle that had started all of this. The rifle that 12 men had died for, that his family would spend the rest of their lives paying for. "Let's go," Vernon said. "We're done here." They withdrew from the property, moving back up the ridge the way they had come, leaving behind 12 bodies and a community that would never be the same. The women in the trailer stayed locked inside, too terrified to come out, not understanding what had happened, just knowing that their men were dead and their world had been destroyed. At 9:47 p.m., Vernon Henderson walked into his father's bedroom, carrying the Winchester Model 70. Elmer was awake, had been awake all evening, waiting. His eyes went to the rifle in Vernon's hands, and something like peace settled over his ravaged face for the first time in months. "You got it back?" Elmer whispered. "I got it back, Daddy. All 12 of them. It's done." Vernon set the rifle on the bed, placed his father's hands on the worn stock. The old man's fingers traced the wood, the metal, the familiar contours of a weapon he'd carried for 29 years, touching it with something like reverence. "That's good," Elmer said. "That's real good." He was quiet for a moment, tears running down his yellowed cheeks, holding the rifle that represented everything he'd worked for, everything he'd been. "You're a good son, Vernon. Good boys. All of you. You did what needed doing. You kept your promise." Vernon sat down beside the bed, exhausted beyond measure, the adrenaline fading, the weight of what they'd done beginning to settle over him like a burial shroud. "What happens now, Daddy?" Elmer's eyes closed. His breathing slowed, became more peaceful than it had been in weeks. "Now," the old man whispered, "we wait, and we pray the Lord understands why we did what we did." At 11:47 p.m., Elmer Henderson died peacefully in his sleep, his Winchester rifle resting across his chest. His sons found him that way the next morning, a slight smile on his face, finally free from the cancer that had been consuming him, finally at rest. He never knew what came next, never knew that the sheriff's department would descend on Laurel Hollow within 72 hours. Never knew that his son and grandsons would spend the rest of their lives paying for the promise they'd kept. Maybe that was a mercy, or maybe Elmer knew exactly what would happen and accepted it as the price of mountain justice, as the cost of being a Henderson in a world that didn't understand what that meant anymore. Either way, he died holding the rifle that had been stolen from him, surrounded by family that loved him enough to kill for him and die for him. Some would call that a good death. Others would call it the beginning of tragedy. But in McDowell County, West Virginia, in November of 1981, it was simply the way things were done, the way they'd always been done, the way they would continue to be done until the mountains themselves crumbled to dust and there were no more Hendersons left to remember. The bodies were discovered at 7:23 a.m. on Sunday, November 15, 1981. Louise Tackett, Frank's wife, had spent the night in the trailer with the other women and children, too terrified to venture outside after the shooting stopped. The gunfire had been deafening, even from 100 yards away. And then the silence that followed had been even worse. Nobody. I slept. Nobody spoke. They just huddled together in the dark, waiting for dawn, waiting for someone to tell them it was safe. When the sun came up and the silence continued, Louise finally gathered enough courage to open the trailer door and step outside. The yard looked like a battlefield. Bodies everywhere, 12 of them, sprawled in the dirt and on the porch, and visible through the windows of the house. Blood, dark and frozen in the November cold, had pooled around each one and soaked into the ground. Louise Tackett screamed. The sound echoed across the hollow, a sound of horror and grief and the complete destruction of everything she'd known. Someone called the sheriff. By 9 a.m., every law enforcement officer in McDowell County was at the scene, which meant 3 deputies and the sheriff himself. By noon, West Virginia State Police had arrived from Charleston, bringing investigators and forensics technicians and the resources that a small county department simply didn't have. By evening, the FBI was making inquiries, the scope of the massacre triggering federal interest in what appeared to be organized criminal activity. 12 bodies, 12 men, aged 21 to 52, all shot with high-powered rifles, all killed within minutes of each other, suggesting multiple shooters, coordination, military-level planning. Detective Howard Morrison from the West Virginia State Police took the lead on the investigation. He was 54 years old, had worked law enforcement in the southern coal fields for 31 years, had seen feuds and murders and violence that would haunt most men's nightmares for the rest of their lives. But walking through Frank Tackett's property on that November morning, counting bodies, documenting the precision of the kills, he felt something he rarely felt anymore: professional respect. Whoever had done this wasn't an amateur. The positioning of the bodies, the angles of the wounds, the complete surprise achieved against a group of armed men, it all spoke to careful planning and ruthless execution. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a drug deal that had collapsed into chaos. This was an operation. Someone had come to this property with the intention of killing everyone present and had accomplished that intention with efficiency that Morrison had rarely seen outside of military operations. Within 24 hours, the community intelligence network that had helped the Hendersons identify the Tacketts now worked in the opposite direction. People talked. People always talked in these hollows. The Hendersons had been asking questions about the Tacketts for weeks. Vernon's father had been robbed just before he died. And now, every man connected to that robbery was dead. The Henderson name came up within 36 hours. Detective Morrison visited the Henderson home place on Tuesday afternoon, found Vernon and his sons gathered there to bury Elmer, who died Sunday night. The funeral had been that morning, a small service at the Free Will Baptist Church, burial in this family cemetery on the ridge. Vernon met Morrison on the porch of his father's house, the house that had been robbed, the house that had started all of this. He didn't invite the detective inside. "My daddy passed on Sunday night," Vernon said. "We just buried him this morning. Not the best time for questions." "I'm sorry for your loss," Morrison said, and he meant it. He'd known men like Elmer Henderson his whole life, hard men who'd worked the mines and raised families and done their best in a place that didn't make anything easy. "I need to ask you some questions about Saturday night. We were here, all of us, sitting with Daddy. He was real bad at the end. Anyone who can verify that? My sons were here. My brother's families came by throughout the day and night. Half the hollow was in and out, paying respects, bringing food, doing what people do when someone's dying." Morrison nodded slowly. The alibi was thin, would be hard to break without physical evidence or witnesses. "You heard what happened over in Tackett Hollow?" Vernon's face showed nothing, the blank expression of a mountain man who'd learned long ago not to give anything away. "Heard something about it. Shooting, people said. Whole crew of them gone. 12 men dead." Morrison watched Vernon's face carefully, looking for any reaction. "Someone walked in and executed them. Professional job, from what I can tell." "That's terrible," Vernon said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I hope you find who did it." Morrison looked at Vernon Henderson, saw the weathered face of a man who'd worked underground for 25 years, who'd raised 4 sons in these hard mountains, who was now burying his father, saw nothing that proved guilt, saw nothing that proved innocence either. "Mr. Henderson, I'm going to be straight with you. Your family had reason to want Frank Tackett dead. The theft from your father's house, the rifle that was taken, that was common knowledge. People are going to point fingers at you and your boys. Let them point." Vernon's voice was steady, betraying nothing. "My daddy died Sunday night. I was here with him. My sons were here. We're a family that takes care of our own detective, but we take care of them proper. We don't go around shooting people in the night. It was a good performance." Morrison almost believed it. But over the next 2 weeks as the investigation continued, evidence began to accumulate. Shell casings recovered from the scene matched calibers known to be in the Henderson family's possession. .308, Winchester, 30-06. Springfield, 30-30, 12-gauge shotgun. Common calibers, but the combination was telling. Tire tracks on a logging road on the ridge above the Tackett property matched the tread pattern on Vernon Henderson's Ford F-250. The tracks were fresh, made sometime in the last few days, probably Saturday night, based on weather analysis. And most damning of all, a witness came forward. A man named Billy Ray Coleman, one of Lester Burke's cousins, had been driving back from a bar in Eiger on Saturday night, had seen vehicles parked on that same logging road around 7 p.m., had seen 5 figures in the headlights, carrying what looked like rifles, moving down the ridge toward Tackett Hollow. On December 1st, 1981, warrants were issued for the arrest of Vernon Henderson, Thomas Henderson, Samuel Henderson, Jacob Henderson, and Daniel Henderson. Charges, 12 counts of first-degree murder. The arrests happened at dawn on December the 2nd. State police and sheriff's deputies approaching the Henderson properties with overwhelming force, 20 officers in tactical gear, expecting possible resistance. These mountains had seen enough standoffs and shootouts over the years that law enforcement took no chances. What they found was Vernon Henderson in his kitchen, drinking coffee, waiting. He didn't resist, neither did his sons. They'd known this was coming from the moment they'd pulled the triggers, had discussed running, had decided against it. Where would they go? These mountains were all they'd ever known. The graves of 7 generations of Hendersons were here. Their roots went too deep to be torn up. "You got the wrong people," Vernon said, as they put him in handcuffs. "But we'll prove that in court." They didn't prove anything in court, not the way Vernon had hoped. The trial, held in Welch in April of 1982, drew national attention. The Appalachian Bloodbath, newspapers called it. Reporters from as far away as New York and Los Angeles descended on McDowell County, trying to understand how 5 members of one family could execute 12 men in a single night over a stolen rifle. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney William Massey, presented a methodical case built on physical evidence and witness testimony: the theft of the rifle, Elmer Henderson's dying wish for revenge, the reconnaissance conducted by Jacob Henderson, the weapons that matched the ballistic evidence, the tire tracks, the witness who'd seen figures on the ridge. They called witnesses from the community who testified about the Henderson family's reputation, about the code they followed, about the previous incidents of violence that had gone unpunished because no one would cooperate with law enforcement. They called the medical examiner who described each of the 12 deaths in clinical detail, the calibers of bullets recovered from the bodies, the angles that indicated where the shooters had been positioned, the professional precision of the operation. They called the women who'd survived, who'd hidden in the trailer while their husbands and brothers and sons were slaughtered outside. The jury sat in silence while Louise Tackett described listening to the gunfire, hearing the screams, not knowing until dawn what had happened. The defense, 4 court-appointed attorneys who looked overwhelmed from the first day of trial, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the Hendersons had an alibi for the night in question, that other people had motive to kill. The Tackett crew, who'd made enemies throughout the county with their thefts and drug dealing. That mountain justice wasn't the same as vigilante murder, that there was a code in these hollows that had to be understood in its proper context. They called character witnesses who testified that the Hendersons were good people, church-going people, people who worked hard and helped their neighbors and had never been in trouble with the law. They called Vernon's wife Martha, who wept on the stand while describing the night her father-in-law died, how the whole family had been gathered around his bedside, how there was no way they could have been anywhere else. They called an expert on Appalachian culture, who tried to explain the code to the jury, the historical context of mountain justice, the way communities in these remote hollows had always handled their own problems because external authority was distant and unreliable. It wasn't enough. The jury, 12 people from McDowell and surrounding counties, people who understood these mountains and this way of life, deliberated for 4 days. Some of them probably sympathized with the Hendersons. Some of them had probably suffered at the hands of the Tacketts themselves, had lost property or peace of mind to that crew's predation. But sympathy wasn't the same as acquittal. On April 27, 1982, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on all counts, all 5 defendants. Vernon Henderson showed no emotion when the verdict was read. Thomas stared straight ahead with military bearing. Samuel closed his eyes. Jacob looked at the floor. Daniel, the youngest, wept quietly, finally understanding the full cost of the choice he'd made. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Vernon Henderson, life in prison without possibility of parole. Thomas Henderson, life without parole. Samuel Henderson, life without parole. Jacob Henderson, life without parole. Daniel Henderson, as the youngest at 23, received 60 years to life. Before sentencing, the judge asked Vernon if he had anything to say. Vernon stood slowly, his wrists shackled, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the work clothes he'd worn his entire life. He looked around the courtroom, at the jury, at the reporters, at the families of the dead men who'd come to see justice done. "Your Honor, those men broke into my father's home while he was dying in the hospital. They stole the rifle he'd treasured for 29 years, the rifle he wanted to pass to his grandson. They stole the money he'd saved for his own funeral. They violated a dying man's home and his dignity and everything he'd worked for." He paused, his voice steady but tired. "I went to the sheriff, asked for help. The deputy took a report and told me nothing would happen, and I knew he was right. Nothing ever happens, not in these mountains, not for people like us. The law doesn't protect us, never has. We protect ourselves." The courtroom was silent. "I'm not saying what we did was right by the law. I understand the law sees it different. But I'm saying it was right by the code my father taught me, and his father taught him, and his father before that. 7 generations my family's lived in these mountains. 7 generations we've followed that code. When someone wrongs you, you make it right. When someone steals from you, you take it back. When someone disrespects your family, you teach them what that costs." He looked directly at the judge. "My father died holding that rifle, died with a smile on his face, knowing his family had stood up for him. That was worth something to him. It's worth something to me. Whatever you decide today, nobody can take that away." The judge sentenced him to life without parole, and Vernon nodded once, as if he'd expected nothing less, as if this was simply the price of keeping a promise to a dying father. Vernon Henderson died in the Mount Olive Correctional Complex in Fayette County, West Virginia, on February 8, 2004. He was 74 years old, had served 22 years of his life sentence. The cancer that killed him was the same kind that had killed his father, lung cancer, a legacy of decades in the coal mines. He'd felt the first symptoms in 2002, had known immediately what they meant, had accepted the diagnosis with the same stoic resignation he'd accepted everything else. He never expressed remorse for the killings. In the rare interviews he granted over the years, he maintained that he'd done what any son would do, what any mountain man would do when his family was wronged and the law wouldn't help. "I'd do it again," Vernon said in a 1996 interview with a reporter from the Charleston Gazette. Every one of those men knew what Frank Tackett was. They helped him steal, helped him hurt people, took their cut of everything he did. They made their choice. We made ours. The reporter asked if he ever thought about the families of the dead men, the women who'd been widowed, the children who'd grown up without fathers. Vernon was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think about them sometimes. Think about how they must have felt that night, hiding in that trailer, hearing the shots. That wasn't something I wanted for them." He paused. "But I think about my daddy too. Think about how he felt when he found out his rifle was gone. Think about him dying in that bed, asking me to make it right. If I'd walked away from that, if I'd let those thieves prosper while my father died in shame, what kind of man would I be? What would I have taught my sons about family, about loyalty, about what it means to be a Henderson?" He shook his head. "Some debts have to be paid, some wrongs have to be righted. That's just the way it is, the way it's always been in these mountains. Maybe the law doesn't understand that. Maybe the rest of the world doesn't understand it. But we do. The Henderson family does. And that's what matters." Thomas Henderson remains incarcerated at the Huttonsville Correctional Center. He's 75 years old now, has been behind bars for 43 years, will die behind bars. Parole denied in 1997, 2007, 2017, and 2023. In his rare correspondence with the outside world, he writes about the mountains he'll never see again, the seasons changing in hollows he'll never walk through, the grandchildren he's never met. He's made peace with it, according to the prison chaplain who visits him weekly. He reads his Bible. He mentors younger inmates. He's found a kind of serenity that surprises people who know what he did. "I don't regret keeping my word to my grandfather," Thomas said in a 2019 letter to a criminology researcher who was writing about the case. "I regret that keeping my word cost me my freedom, but if I had it to do over, knowing what I know now, I'd still do it. Some things are more important than freedom. Family is more important. Honor is more important. The Henderson name is more important." Samuel Henderson was killed in a prison fight in 1993, stabbed by another inmate over a dispute that the official reports never fully explained. He was 40 years old, had served 11 years of a life sentence. Some people said it was revenge, relatives of the Tackett crew finally catching up with him. Others said it was just prison violence, random and meaningless. Either way, Samuel Henderson died the same way the men he'd killed had died. Suddenly, violently, far from the mountains he'd loved. Jacob Henderson, the woodsman, the one who'd planned the approach routes and fired some of the most difficult shots that night, died of a heart attack in 2019. He was 64 years old, had spent 37 years in prison. He'd been approved for compassionate release 3 months before his death, was supposed to go to a hospice facility to spend his final weeks surrounded by family. He never made it out. The paperwork got delayed, the way paperwork always gets delayed, and Jacob Henderson died in a prison infirmary instead of in the mountains he'd known better than anyone. Daniel Henderson, the youngest, was paroled in 2021 after serving 40 years. He was 63 years old, had spent his entire adult life behind bars for a crime he'd committed when he was barely more than a boy. The parole board cited his exemplary behavior, his educational achievements, his counseling work with other inmates. They also cited the passage of time, the fact that the man before them bore little resemblance to the 23-year-old who'd participated in the massacre. Daniel lives in Charleston now, as far from McDowell County as he can get while remaining in West Virginia. He works part-time at a nonprofit that helps former inmates transition back into society. He doesn't talk about what happened in 1981, doesn't grant interviews, doesn't return to the mountains where 7 generations of his family had lived. When asked why he doesn't visit the family cemetery, why he doesn't tend his grandfather's grave, or his father's grave, or his brother's graves, Daniel's answer is simple and sad. There's nobody left to visit with. The hollow is empty. The houses fell down. The roads grew over. Even the cemetery is hard to find now, overgrown with brush, the headstones tilted and covered with moss. He pauses. Sometimes I dream about it. Dream. I'm back there, young again, walking through the woods with my daddy and my brothers. Dream the mountains are still alive, still full of our people. Then I wake up, and I'm old, and everyone's gone. The hollow is empty. The Henderson family is over. We're all dead or dying, and there's nobody coming after us to carry on the name. The families of the 12 dead men scattered like leaves after the trial. Louise Tackett, Frank's widow, moved to Kentucky with her children, changed their names, started over in a place where nobody knew what her husband had been. Donnie's wife did the same, went to Ohio, disappeared into suburbs where the Henderson name was just syllables that meant nothing. The Tackett name is gone from those hollows now. The handful of families who remained eventually moved away, driven out by the memories, by the stigma, by the poverty that consumed the whole county as the coal industry completed its collapse. Today, the hollow is mostly empty, a few hunting cabins, some old foundations hidden by 40 years of new growth, trees pushing up through what used to be yards and roads. Frank Tackett's house burned down in 1996, an electrical fire that might have been arson or might have been decades of neglect. The volunteer fire department made no real effort to save it. Too far back in the hollow, they said. Roads too bad. Nobody living there anyway. The fire burned itself out, left behind a charred foundation that the forest is slowly reclaiming. McDowell County has continued its decline. The population that was nearly 50,000 in 1981 is barely 16,000 today, falling every year as the old people die and the young people leave. Welch, the county seat, looks like a ghost town, more empty storefronts than occupied ones, more abandoned buildings than functioning businesses. The median household income is among the lowest in the United States. Life expectancy has actually declined over the past 2 decades, a phenomenon almost unheard of in the developed world. The old ways are almost entirely dead now. The code that Vernon Henderson followed, the code that said, a man takes care of his own, that some offenses demand blood, that mountain justice is different from courtroom justice, that code has faded as the communities that sustained it have faded. There's nobody left to teach it, nobody left to enforce it. Nobody left who remembers when these mountains had rules that existed outside the law. Detective Howard Morrison retired in 1998 after 45 years in law enforcement. In a 2012 interview for a documentary about Appalachian crime, he reflected on the Henderson case. I've thought about that case for 30 years, Morrison said. Thought about whether justice was served, whether the punishment fit the crime. By the law, the Hendersons were murderers. They planned and executed the killing of 12 men. That's not in dispute. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But by the code of these mountains, by the rules that have governed these communities for 200 years, Vernon Henderson was a son honoring his father's dying wish. The Tacketts had stolen from a dying man, had violated his home, had taken his most treasured possession, and would have faced no consequences at all if the Hendersons hadn't acted. The law wouldn't help. The law never helped, not in places like McDowell County, not for people like Elmer Henderson. Morrison shook his head. I'm not saying what they did was right. I'm saying I understand why they did it. And in these hollows, in these mountains where the outside world has never really reached, understanding is sometimes the best you can hope for. The Winchester Model 70 rifle, the one that started everything, is supposedly in an evidence locker somewhere in the McDowell County courthouse. After the trial, it was supposed to be returned to the Henderson family as the property of a victim of the original theft, but there was nobody left to claim it. Vernon was in prison for life. His brothers had distanced themselves from the whole affair. The other relatives had scattered. Somewhere, in a basement storage room, in a decaying courthouse in a dying county, a rifle sits in a box, waiting for someone who will never come. A rifle that a man treasured for 29 years. A rifle that his son killed 12 men to recover. A rifle that a whole family destroyed themselves to bring home. That's the final irony of the Appalachian Bloodbath of 1981. Elmer Henderson wanted the rifle to stay in the family, to be passed down through generations like the land and the traditions and the code itself. Instead, it sits in a box, forgotten, a symbol of something that used to matter in mountains where nothing much matters anymore. 43 years have passed since that November night. The mountains haven't changed. They're the same ancient peaks and valleys they've been for millions of years, indifferent to the human dramas played out in their shadows. But everything else has changed. The coal is mostly gone, the people are mostly gone, the old ways of living and dying are gone. What remains is just the land itself, waiting patiently for the forest to reclaim everything that humans built, waiting for the hollows to fill with trees again, waiting for the memories to fade into silence. Every few years, someone writes an article or makes a documentary about the Henderson family and what happened in 1981. They interview the few survivors, visit the empty hollows, try to understand what drove 5 men to kill 12 others over a stolen rifle. Most of them don't understand, can't understand. The code that governed these mountains wasn't rational, wasn't proportionate, wasn't fair by any modern standard. It was just the way things were, the way they'd been for generations, the only law that existed in places where the official law was distant and useless, and had never really tried to protect the people who needed protection most. Vernon Henderson understood that code, lived by it, died by it. He never apologized, never expressed doubt, never suggested that things could have been different. "My father asked me to do something for him," Vernon said in his final interview, conducted 2 months before his death. "Asked me to get his rifle back, to make things right with the people who'd wronged him, his last request of his oldest son. What kind of man would I be if I'd said no? What kind of son turns away from his dying father?" He paused, coughing, the cancer already filling his lungs with fluid. "I know what the law says. I know what the courts decided. I know that by the standards of the outside world, I'm a murderer. But in here," he touched his chest, "in my heart, I know I did right by my father. I kept my promise. I brought him his rifle and he died holding it. That's worth something. That's worth everything. And nobody, not the law, not the prison, not death itself, can take that away from me." It's an uncomfortable conclusion, one that doesn't satisfy anyone who believes in law and order and proportionate justice. 12 men dead over a rifle that was worth maybe $300. 5 men spending their lives in prison over a theft that might have been resolved with a police report and an insurance claim in some other place, some other time. But McDowell County in 1981 wasn't some other place, and 1981 wasn't some other time. There were no insurance claims in Laurel Hollow. The police didn't protect people like Elmer Henderson. The courts didn't deliver justice to victims of men like Frank Tackett. What existed was mountains and isolation, and a code that said, when the law fails, you make your own law. When justice is denied, you take justice into your own hands. Vernon Henderson made his own law. His sons followed him into it. And 12 men paid the price for a theft they probably thought would never be punished, in a place where they thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. If this story made you think about justice, revenge, and the price we pay when ordinary men decide that honor is worth killing for, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far people will go when the systems that should protect them fail completely. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting your family and becoming a murderer? What would you have done if someone stole the last precious thing connecting you to your dying father? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, somewhere in a forgotten hollow where the law doesn't reach and the old codes still hold power. The names change, the weapons change, but the mountains keep their secrets, and the blood that's spilled there seeps into the ground and disappears, leaving behind only questions that have no good answers and graves that the forest slowly covers until there's nothing left to show that anyone ever lived or died there at all. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one theft, one insult, one dying father's request at a time. And sometimes, by the time we realize what we've become, there's nothing left but prison walls and empty hollows and the fading memory of a rifle that meant everything to someone who's been dead for 40 years.